What happens when a country's greatest moment of celebration is also its largest, most tragic funeral? It's a massive contradiction, right? And it sits right at the very heart of the Indian subcontinent's modern history. Today, we're going to try and make sense of it. Think about the year 1947. For literally hundreds of millions of people, this year was everything. It marked the triumphant end of British rule. It was the birth of an independent India and the creation of a brand new nation, Pakistan. You just can't overstate the feeling of hope in the air. But, and this is a huge but, that hope was built on top of something truly horrific. Because alongside independence came the partition. It was this violent tearing apart of the land that led to over 14 million people being displaced and the deaths of up to 2 million. So how in the world does a culture even begin to process a trauma on that scale? Well, it turns to art. And partition literature became the main way to channel all that collective pain. It's a genre that deliberately points the camera away from the big picture politics, the leaders making speeches, and zooms right in on the ordinary people who paid the ultimate price. Okay, so as writers started to really grapple with this catastrophe, a really powerful set of themes began to pop up again and again. It created this unique and pretty harrowing literary genre. Let's dig into the DNA of these stories. These themes really capture all the different angles of the trauma. First there's just the sheer insanity of the violence, where neighbors who'd lived together for centuries suddenly became monsters to each other overnight. Then, so tragically, women's bodies became a literal battlefield. And a huge theme you see is writers just hammering on the absurdity of these new borders, basically asking, how can a line drawn on a map by some guy thousands of miles away suddenly erase our shared history and change who we are? To really get this, though, we have to look at the stories themselves. So we're going to explore 3 absolute landmark works: a novel in English, a short story in Urdu, and a novel in Hindi. And each one gives us a totally unique window into the soul of the partition. First up, we've got Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan. The story is set in this tiny fictional border village called Mano Madra, and it's a place where Sikhs and Muslims have lived in perfect harmony for generations. It's basically a little snapshot of the peace that was about to be completely shattered. This is the absolutely devastating final image of the novel, and it captures the book's central idea perfectly, that when you're faced with this huge political hatred, sometimes the only thing that can stand up to it is individual love and sacrifice. So how do we get to that brutal climax? Well, the peace in this little village is destroyed when a ghost train arrives from Pakistan. It's silent, and it's filled with corpses. This horrific sight just ignites this fire of vengeance. But in the middle of all this rising hatred, you've got this small forbidden love story between Juga, a local Sikh troublemaker, and Nooran, a Muslim girl. And while the educated leaders of the village are just kind of paralyzed debating what to do, Juga, the criminal, is the one who acts. He sacrifices his own life to save the train that's carrying Nooran and her whole community to safety in Pakistan. Next, we have to talk about Saadat Hasan Manto. He is the undisputed master of this genre, period. And in his famous story, Toba Tek Singh, he exposes the madness of partition through satire by setting his story in the one place that's supposed to already be mad, a lunatic asylum. This right here is one of the most famous lines in all of South Asian literature. It's the story's tragic punchline. The main character, Bishan Singh, he becomes a symbol for the millions of people who were made homeless, who lost their identity, because of a political decision they couldn't even begin to understand. The setup is just brilliantly absurd. Years after partition, the 2 governments decide they need to exchange asylum inmates. And the inmates themselves are completely baffled. How can their homes suddenly be in another country? All Bishan Singh wants to know is one thing. Is his village, Toba Tek Singh, in India or is it in Pakistan? When he's finally told it's in Pakistan but he has to go to India, he just refuses. He dies right there, in that little strip of earth between the 2 border fences, a no man's land, the only place left for someone who refuses to be divided. All right, our final case study, Bisham Sani's Tamas, which means darkness, takes a totally different approach. It was written decades later, so it's not really about the chaos of the moment. Instead, it's like a cold, hard investigation into how that chaos was deliberately created. This side, it lays out the novel's core argument in 3 simple steps. See, Sani is arguing that these horrific riots weren't some spontaneous explosion of ancient hatred. Nope. They were engineered, and it all started with a single, calculated act designed to set a city on fire. The story kicks off with a poor man named Nathu. He gets paid a tiny bit of money to kill a pig for what he's told is a veterinary experiment. The next morning, that pig's dead body is found on the steps of a mosque, a huge act of sacrilege. From there, Sahini meticulously shows us how this single event is turned into a weapon. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the whole city just erupts into violence. The novel basically exposes the machinery of hatred, showing how politicians can use poor people as pawns and religious symbols as triggers for unimaginable violence. So, there you have it. 3 authors, 3 incredible stories, all staring into the same abyss of 1947. But what's so fascinating is that they each come back with a very different report on what they saw down there. This table really just lays it all out perfectly, doesn't it? Khushwant Singh, he finds a sliver of heroic redemption in all the chaos. Manto, he finds only cynical, nihilistic absurdity. He's basically suggesting the political world is way more insane than any asylum. And then Sani gives us this gritty, realistic breakdown of cause and effect, showing the violence was a calculated political tool. You can even see it in their symbols. The train, which can mean life or death, the no man's land is the only truthful place left, and the pig as the simple, ugly catalyst for mass hatred. So why does all this literature still matter so much, even today? What's its ultimate legacy? Well, it's all about remembering the real price of freedom. These stories are what you'd call a vital counter-narrative. While the official history textbooks might celebrate the triumph of independence, this literature forces us to remember the blood. It reminds every single generation of the human cost of drawing lines on a map, and it insists that the stories of the nameless victims are every bit as important as the stories of the famous leaders. And that leaves us with a central, haunting question that this entire body of work really asks. It's a question that challenges the very meaning of freedom and nationhood, and it makes sure we never ever forget the darkness that came with the dawn.
Today we're going to explore how literature can help us understand one of the most painful events of the 20th century. We're talking about the partition of India, but we're going beyond the dates and the numbers to get to the human stories, the ones that are literally etched into memory.
So let's start with a really powerful question. What actually happens when a line, just a simple line drawn on a map, suddenly cuts right through the middle of millions of lives? You know, this isn't just a political question. It's about family, identity, and what home even means when it's suddenly ripped in two. And these are the staggering facts of the matter. In 1947, the stroke of a pen created 2 new countries, India and Pakistan. But that same stroke of a pen also unleashed this tidal wave of violence, displacing 15 million people. Think about that number, and it led to the deaths of over 1 million. The scale is it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around.
And that's exactly why we're here today. See, history books, they're great at giving us the what, the where, and the when. But literature gives us how it felt. It takes us right inside the hearts and minds of the people who actually lived through it. And that, right there, is where real understanding begins.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to look at 3 powerful literary works, and each one gives us a totally unique prism to view this catastrophe through. First, the intellectual trauma of memory. Then, the brutal reality of survival. And finally, the psychological horror of dehumanization.
All right, let's dive into our first lens. This is all about memory, about how the trauma of an event can haunt generations, lingering like a shadow long, long after it's over. And for this, we're looking at Amitav Ghosh's absolute masterpiece, The Shadow Lines.
So the whole idea of this book revolves around what Ghosh calls shadow lines. He basically argues that borders are, well, they're artificial. They don't actually exist in nature, right? You can't see them from a plane. And yet, down on the ground, people are willing to shed real blood, to kill and die for them. And he illustrates this so brilliantly through this one character, Thama, who's the narrator's grandmother. Now, she is a fierce nationalist. She believes in the border. So when she's flying to Dhaka, she literally expects to look down and see a physical line on the ground dividing the countries. But of course, all she sees is just earth, identical fields. The line only exists in her mind.
And this is where the tragedy of the novel really hits home. The climax is a riot in one country that's a direct, violent reaction to something that happened in the other. So despite this border, the two nations are just locked in this violent embrace, mirroring each other's hatreds. The shadow line didn't stop the bloodshed. In so many ways, it actually created it.
Okay, let's move to our next prism. We're shifting from this sort of intellectual trauma of memory to the brutal physical reality of just trying to survive. For this, we're looking at a raw, incredibly unflinching short story called The Final Solution.
The scene is just bleak. Imagine a chaotic railway station overflowing with starving refugees. And in the middle of all this, we meet a mother named Malika. Her husband is sick, her child is hungry, and there's this man circling, preying on the desperate, offering help. But really, he just sees her as a commodity he can exploit. And this is where the story just completely turns on its head. Malika goes with him, but she absolutely refuses to be a victim. In this stunning act of self-preservation, she actually overpowers and kills her would-be exploiter, takes his money, and goes right back to feed her family.
And this brings us to this really powerful concept called dark agency. Malika isn't just some passive victim of her circumstances. No way. She fights back. But her survival, it comes at a terrible moral price. The final solution to her poverty isn't some act of charity. It's a violent act, born of pure, raw desperation.
And now we come to our final, and honestly, our most devastating prism. This one explores how extreme violence can do more than just kill the body. It can completely shatter the human soul. This is Saadat Hasan Manto's infamous story, Khol, which means open it.
The story actually starts with this little glimmer of hope. In the total chaos of a refugee camp, a father named Sirajuddin has lost his young daughter Sakina. He's frantic, and he entrusts her rescue to a group of young men, volunteers who are supposed to be the protectors of their community.
But as the days just tick by, that hope starts to curdle into dread. The men who promised to bring Sakina back, they're gone. The agonizing wait just stretches on, and you get this sinking feeling that something is terribly, terribly wrong.
And then finally, an unconscious girl is brought to a hospital. It's Sakina. The doctor, just trying to get some air into the stuffy room, turns to her father and says the fateful words, "Khol, open the window."
And here is the absolute horror of the story. When she hears those words, open it, Sakina's body just responds automatically. Mechanically, she has been so repeatedly, brutally violated by her so-called rescuers that her mind now associates that command with only one thing. It's a reflex, born from a trauma that is just unimaginable.
In the final, gut-wrenching irony is delivered by our own father. He sees her move, and in his overwhelming relief, he completely fails to understand the meaning of her action. He just shouts with joy, "She is alive! She is alive!" He's celebrating that her body has survived, completely unaware that her spirit, her very soul, has been murdered.
So, let's bring these three powerful portraits together. They're very different stories, but they all paint a picture of a single unhealed wound, a wound that continues to bleed through generations.
So when you look at them all together, you really see three distinct layers of the very same catastrophe. The shadow lines shows us the intellectual trauma of these arbitrary lines on a map. The final solution reveals the brutal physical cost of survival. And Khol, well, Khol exposes the ultimate psychological wound, the absolute death of the soul.
And that's really the crucial point here. Partition was never just a political event about drawing new maps. It was a deeply personal, human catastrophe that completely shattered families, minds, and bodies. And it's literature that gives us access to that pain, that reality, in a way no history book ever could.
Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder. If history gives us the cold, hard facts of what happened, do these stories, in their exploration of human suffering and resilience and horror, actually give us something deeper? Do they give us the truth?